Good morning again. It's a pleasure to be with y'all again, to make that drive over from Fort Worth. I came with my dad and my daughter, but she's a little bit wild, so she's kind of in and out. Maybe you'll see her here in a minute. Anyways, it's a pleasure to be with you. We have another gospel story about food. 2 weeks ago, if you've been with us and we're following the lectionary, we departed from Mark and moved into the Gospel of John with the feeding of the 5,000, which is actually many more than 5,000, including women and children. And last week, we had a story of Jesus saying, "I'm the bread of life, and those who come to me will never be hungry." And that's where our gospel picks up today. That verse 35 was actually repeated, I believe, last week and then this week as well. And we get more on this same theme, which you could call kind of a sermon series about food. This week's story is maybe a little less known than the feeding of the 5,000, for instance. Jesus, last week and this week, is telling people, I hate to break it to you, I'm not just handing out free food. We're talking about some spiritual food at this point. Now, the Gospel of John is often a lot more mystical, so it makes sense that we're moving in that direction. But we do have both stories in John, the feeding of literal food, and then Jesus moving into talk of spiritual food. This statement, I am the bread of life, is the first I am statement that Jesus makes in this gospel, and it doesn't go over very well, if you picked up on that. We hear that people were not happy about Jesus' claim to be the bread of life. They're saying, who is this guy? We know his mom, we know his dad. He did not just drop from the sky. And they're trying to figure this out. Perhaps they felt it was also a little bit cruel, I don't know what word to use, when people are coming to him hungry, okay, asking for actual food, and he says, oh, you want bread? Actually, I'm the bread of life. And they're thinking, okay. It almost makes me wonder whether first century people were as food obsessed as we are today in our culture, in a different way, albeit. But it makes me think of Chopped, if anybody watches it. Do you know how many episodes there are now? Anyone want to guess? 747. Okay, there you go. Looked it up. We love food. I get the feeling that food was on the forefront of Jesus' followers' mind too, but for different reasons. Many of them were starving. They were very, very hungry, okay? Hence the endless metaphors about food, about bread, wine, yeast, milk, honey, cattle, and sheep, and all these things, olives. Sometimes we like to say food is fuel, to remind ourselves to eat for the right reasons or eat the right things. But I remember a dear theologian friend lamenting this statement and saying, you know, that may be true, but food is not just fuel. There's so much wrapped up in how food is tied to our story, our heritage, our memories, our senses, our instincts, how we socialize. Food seems to be an ever-present topic in society in the first century and, yes, today. Case in point, Food Network. And don't we all love the channel? Because it seems to be a mental break from the politics, right? No controversy, no 24-hour news cycle on there, just fun food. But of course, the truth is that food can be quite the political topic when we really think about it. What you should and shouldn't eat and how much, and who you should or shouldn't eat with have also been ever-present topics in history and today, both in non-religious circles as well as religious ones. Just ask anyone who's been excommunicated by a church. I would put money on the fact that one of you in here has been. Multiple people in my close family have been, not in the ELCA, but you get the gist. We're talking in the 20th and 21st century. Churches, people are saying, you can't sit with us while we're eating. A little bitter about it, you know, but. Who we break bread with says something about us, and who we allow into our circles and at our tables says something about us. Food is a little bit political. In the way I read this gospel, Jesus is telling us that it is the Father who acts to draw people to Jesus, Jesus doesn't turn anyone away as far as I can see. Jesus offers himself as living bread and provides salvation. It's not that you have to be saved first before receiving the bread of life. That would be backwards to what the gospel is saying today. God calls us. We step forward with belief and trust that what we are receiving is truly living bread. And in receiving it, we participate in salvation. None of us come with a perfect faith or a perfect belief. And who are we to ever turn away someone that God has brought or called to our table? Yes, food is a little trickier than what we see on Food Network. Beautiful colors, bright, clean, high-end kitchens, and perfectly concocted little macarons. I can't do that. According to the World Health Organization, though, this topic, though it's not flashy, and you've probably heard about it many times, hunger remains the single greatest threat to the world's public health, contributing to about half of the world's child deaths. Moderate to severe food insecurity affected about 29% of the world's population in 2021. And this is a true and stark contrast to America's overabundance and tendency towards gross wastefulness, not everywhere, but in a lot of the US. And still, by contrast, it's worth noting, and I'm sure you've all heard, that food insecure families are in every neighborhood in the US, every county in America, and in our own backyards as well. So when it comes to food politics, there are also complex questions about how best to support farmers and preserve farmlands, and how best to ensure that the animals we're eating are being treated properly. All of these things are wrapped up in how we think about food. Now, unfortunately, I think Lutheranism's kind of lax ideas about what we should consume have led to kind of a complacency and a lack of ethical guidance around this topic. So it's worth saying that just because we have theological and religious freedom to do something like eat whatever we want, it doesn't mean we necessarily should. I've experienced that as kind of a stark contrast to my Jewish friends who eat kosher, my Muslim friends who eat halal, and my Seventh-day Adventist friends, for instance, who often eat vegetarian, even my Catholic friends who choose fish on Fridays. It made me think of that one time I was at an interfaith conference, and I was a Christian representative at this conference. It was actually led by an Islamic group. I attended a lecture about halal eating, and the person who was leading it said that it wasn't just about restrictions and what you shouldn't eat, like pork, but it was also about ethical eating. And for some reason, it really stuck with me when the speaker lamented about the complexity of trying to eat ethically, and about how one moral dilemma led to another and another, and how she never felt like she was quite doing it right or doing enough. But in the end, she commissioned us not to become discouraged like she had. She commissioned us to try one thing at a time, maybe one small change, and maybe another next year. And she encouraged us, saying that just because it's complex does not mean we should ignore the problem or do nothing. And I actually really took that to heart. I started being a lot more conscious of where my meat was coming from. And if anyone's rolling their eyes, oh, this is a hippie sermon. My husband grew up on a farm, and a wheat farm and a cattle ranch, and he rolls his eyes enough for everyone, so there you go. And my point in saying that is we all have different ways of approaching this, and there are different ways or different changes that you might want to make in your life that make sense for you and that could contribute to food justice. But after I started thinking about meat, a few years later, I began composting, and later I started using less single-use items and kind of took it a little bit at a time. And maybe one day I will be a better gardener. I don't know. I'm no good right now. I think it's really cool that that Muslim speaker and myself, shared a love for the planet and the one God that created us, and a desire to care for it and all that's in it. Food can be controversial, and food can really connect us. And Jesus knew that, I think. He teaches us to pray for what? Our daily bread. Nothing more, nothing less for that day. And while it's good, I think, that Lutherans do not have strict dietary laws that could possibly serve as a barrier between us and the divine, and I think it's good that dietary laws don't serve as a litmus test for faith in Lutheranism, I think we do miss out a little bit on the conversation starters about what consumption and ethical consumption could or should look like in Christianity and in Lutheranism. And we also sometimes miss out on important conversations about what to do with our abundance and how to be in relationship with those in need. It's easy to avoid the topic of food justice, again, because it's complex and because it means confronting some of our wrongs and potentially making changes to our behavior and our actions. But thinking about this topic means asking the question of how much is enough, and how did we come to a place of needing more and more, and where's the line, and how has our sense of worth become tied up in these things that we own and we desire and we think we need? All of these questions are underneath the question of how we consume food and what it means to consume actual food and to be nourished actually, spiritually as well. So food is non-political until it's not. Jesus' followers were hungry, literally, yes, but they were also in need of more than they even knew to ask for. We too, I think, are often, and me for sure, in need of more than I even know how to ask for. In last year's text, we heard the group following Jesus asking these bumbling questions. Rabbi, where did you come from? And then they ask, what works must we do to perform the works of God? And then they ask, what sign are you going to give us so we know that you're the one? What are you going to do for us, kind of? Not great questions, but questions we all tend to ask, either subconsciously or actually. Who are you, God, and why won't you give us what we think we want and what we think we need? What good are you then? Jesus kind of redirects us. We don't have to know exactly what we need or what to ask for in order to reach out our hand and receive the bread. We don't have to have perfect faith, only a bit of belief. Jesus talks about that today. Belief that got you here today, perhaps, by God's grace. We don't have to know what to ask for. We don't need to believe or behave perfectly in order to receive the bread of life. And the folks in this story sure didn't behave perfectly. In fact, Jesus' patience with these folks is maybe the miracle that we see today. But in our bumbling and our questions and our complaining, our imperfections, our doubt, it says in the gospel they were complaining today. Remember, they asked, who is this guy? In all of that, Jesus redirects us to a bread that endures. We are given answers to questions we didn't know we had. And we're invited into deeper, better questions about how food connects us, how our physical and spiritual worlds are connected, and how our practice of equitable distribution of communion can be replicated in our choices and our behavior throughout the week and in our life, one day at a time, to the glory of God. In a hymn from the 18th century called Guide Me, Great Jehovah, we sing, Bread of Heaven, feed me till I want no more. Perhaps this is a fitting redirection of our consumeristic nature. Feed us with heavenly food until we are stuffed. That is the abundance we seek. Amen.